Let me share my screen as well. I don't have a real agenda for today. Just maybe 2 small topics. But let me share my screen first and open OneNote. All right, so today we are November 3rd, if you can believe it. We have topics. We can start with your question. It's a commonly asked question, so it's good to talk about it. So let's call it migration from V2 to V3. I have new documentation for V2. So it's not new documentation itself, but it's a new engine with new capabilities because the current one is broken. New documentation place. That's more accurate. And I would like to talk a little bit about 2.9.2 release candidate. This is all I have. If anyone has any topics they would like to discuss or any demos, I'm all ears.
Hey, good evening.
Hey, Frans.
Hey, yeah, I had one small question actually. In the extent of what we're using for the UI-driven Elsa support, basically. We noticed that when you have a mixture of user task and background task, basically, there is a gap in between the presentation that you can do in the UI when the user task isn't running and the background task is running. I query, for instance, all the user tasks to get a to-do list, but when it's running a background task, it's not waiting for a user task. So it pops in and out of the list. And to mitigate that problem, I saw there was a metadata, which I can use then to say, for instance, the current state and so on, and the current user that is working on it and so on. But I was wondering, are there any best practices in using metadata versus variables, for instance? And if there is any guidance on that.
Metadata versus workflow, variables.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Let's see if we can talk about that and get an understanding of what's what and what would be better for your scenario. So great. Migration from V2 to V3. Let's start with that. And the question more elaborately typed in here was based on where Elsa version 3 is at currently, how much work would it be to migrate from version 2 to version 3? The short answer is basically you will have to recreate your workflows. The model of V3 is completely different from V2. That being said, we have been talking about potentially adding a let's say an Elsa 2 activity type, because in Elsa 3 you can create custom activities that represent different kinds of workflows or diagrams. So technically that should be possible, but it's also a bit time consuming. So we have to see if we want to do it and when. I think it would be good to have, because there's many Elsa 2 users and they would benefit from taking advantage of Elsa 3 without having to basically recreate their entire solution to work on Elsa 3. So for workflows, it's possible, but the tricky part will also be, of course, the custom activities. The bulk of custom activities that one would have written should be able to be mapped close to one-on-one, because the bulk of the logic is would be application specific or specific to that particular activity, and the main differences would just be the syntax around it to follow the Elsa 3 syntax that there will be some work involved there, but that would be mostly copy and paste. In terms of existing workflow instances, they would not port over automatically. You would have to implement some data transformation, some mapping. Or another strategy could be to, let's imagine you do have an Elsa 2 server. You could choose to keep that one running, but create new workflows or recreate V2 workflows in Elsa 3, and then let new processes be activated on this new server, and let the old ones in version 2 just run to the end. But if, depending on the timeline, of course, if you need to have a workflow engine today, the only real option would be to go with version 2, because version 3 isn't production ready, and it's still being refactored significantly at certain points. But if you need something somewhere in the beginning of next year, then Elsa 3 might be a good option to start looking at the beginning of next year. I wouldn't recommend looking into it right now, because there's still broken aspects that are real blockers for Elsa 3 to be properly used without any guidance or documentation. So yeah, that it would also depend on the timeline. If you're trying to understand, should you start with version 2 or version 3, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I really appreciate the breakdown of that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I think for our unique scenario, it's probably start with V2, since we don't already have an existing library of activities that would need to be ported, and kind of keep it light until V3 gets released. But we just want to start using it, essentially. So
yeah, that makes sense. If you don't have too many workflows, or just a few, and you need some custom activities, they would be easily transported or ported to Elsa 3. And then if you don't have too many workflows, or they are not too complex, then it's easy to it should be easy to recreate those workflows in Elsa 3 once it's ready.
Wonderful. I appreciate it very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for the question. Unless anyone else has a follow-up question on this, we can move on to the next topic, which is the new documentation place for version 2. So let me explain a little bit about what's going on here. So we have documentation for Elsa 2 today. It's hosted on Elsa Workflows GitHub.io. And that's fine, that there's no problem with the host. The problem is with the underlying NPM packets that generates this website based on Markdown, and it's using DocuSource, which is an open source project created originally by Facebook, I believe. But this is an old version, and at some point it just didn't want to build anymore. It would just break when I run the build command. Could be fixed, probably. I couldn't figure it out within a certain amount of time, and I didn't want to spend too much time on it either, because I actually want to work on Elsa 3 documentation, and while I was looking for a different engine for Elsa 3 documentation, I realized we could also choose to just port over the Elsa 2 documentation to that same engine. The good thing being, of course, the Elsa 2 documentation is pretty out of date, and this would give us a chance to update it at the same time, and be able to actually deploy it to the website too. Because even though we could update the Elsa 2 documentation and push it to GitHub, but it would not be deployed. So that was a shame. But what I want to show is the new location, which is, so this is the old one, or the current one, and the new location would be v2.elsaworkflows.io, and it's using a different engine. It's hosted on Versal, which is a pretty cool hosting environment, and it has CI/CD built in. So every time we push something to this repo, Versal will build, will take that and create a new build and deploy it automatically to this host. And all of the content is there. It has it looks a little bit different, but the structure is the same. Two good new features that we get for free by doing this migration is we get certs. So there's we are now able to search through the documentation, which is a common complaint of this website is there's no search feature. So that's automatically solved here, which is nice. Although it's not yet implemented, so I need to sign up for Algolia, which I did just now, and they are going to review and make sure that this is indeed an open source project and not some commercial project. So I'm waiting for their approval. Once that's done, I can start hooking up this search UI into the Algolia backend. And very important is the dark mode feature, which we don't have with the current website. So I think this is the deciding reason for me to migrate.
Yeah, Hugo is going to be happy about the dark mode.
Exactly.
But I didn't know that the search was free for. I looked into that one as well because this is a Tailwind template, right?
Yeah. So this good point. This is a Tailwind UI template from Tailwind Labs, and they have a new section called templates, and it looks pretty amazing. So they used just Tailwind CSS to create all of these beautiful templates. So they have Salient for the SaaS marketing template, something for your personal website, transmit, etc. And then the documentation uses the syntax template.
Yeah.
And it looks like this, as you can see. So it's pretty good looking. If I
okay, yeah, I looked into this as well, and I'm currently using it. I did some upgrades in the elements of this to be able to have multiple levels on the left side and go a bit more deeper and not having that full menu on the left. So yeah, I liked it. I liked it really when working with it. So that's fun.
Yeah, exactly. And what's nice is it's using Next.js, and the documentation, you write it in Markdown, but you can create these widgets or tags, as they call it, that translate to React components. So you can create very fancy React components and then just use them in your documentation.
Yeah. Because I created a settings file for that, basically dictating how the menu should look, depending on where you were in the site and which level of page you were on. And then the menu could be a bit more dynamic, that it's not really long on the left side.
Oh, I see. And this documentation website that you mentioned, it's publicly available?
Not for that part what I'm talking about now, but I'm working on that part now, but it needs to be published yet. But
I see.
I will look at this version as well, because you sent me the link, right, to this one for the Git repo. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Just to include it with the notes, it is here. It's also documentation. It's this one. So the V2 documentation goes into the V2 folder. V3 goes there.
Yeah.
And the link, right? And so the V3 documentation, this is all. This is not the real text. Well, this is just a tryout but the menu, etc., it's still just from the syntax template. So it's I really have to just still get started with this documentation. But I wanted to get the version 2 documentation out of the way first. So next step for me is to get started with the Elsa 3 documentation, turning all of the packages or the projects into NuGet packages, so that they can be actually be downloaded from MyGet or GitHub. I was looking into GitHub's options of hosting NuGet packages, and I think they host it as well. And then instead of using Adveyor that we've been using for Elsa 2, I would like to just try out GitHub Actions for the CI/CD pipeline.
I can say from experience, GitHub Actions, like pushing packages to the GitHub NuGet package manager and consuming them is relatively easy, even with a private registry.
Oh, that's great. So you
really
confirm
nice.
it can be hosted on GitHub, the NuGet packages. Great.
Yeah.
That's perfect. Then it's nice because then everything is in one place: the source code, the CI/CD pipeline, and the preview packages.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons at my work we went to it, is because we were on MyGet with packages and we had repos somewhere else. When we moved to GitHub, it was nice having source code, CI/CD, and on the homepage you can see the packages associated with the repo just right there.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Great.
Doesn't that need an externals place to host in NuGet packages? Can it be just on GitHub?
Yeah. So it'll be essentially, you can either do it like through a NuGet config where you have GitHub, essentially the repository as your GitHub package source.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think
that's
it's
cool.
Free for public open source projects. I want to say, I don't know, I'm not sure what the storage limit is on it. But there's also built-in. There's some actions from GitHub to clean up old packages, so you can go clean up all your old previews on a release. So if there's a PR to master closed, you can go clean up all the old previews that aren't valid anymore with 5 lines of code. So it's really nice.
That's pretty neat.
Yeah,
that is awesome.
We leverage it extensively, and NPM packages as well.
Yeah, exactly. I was looking at NPM registry as well for the designer stuff. So it's that's great. Then everything is in one place, even the Docker registry. It seems like it supports this. Replaced by container registry. Okay. Very cool. Yeah. So, needless to say, I cannot wait to get started with this. And once we have some quick starts and installation guides with Elsa 3, then that's also the moment where people can, of course, start to try it out and be assured, hopefully, that it won't change too much. There's still a lot of missing features, little quirks and little usability issues in the designer. But part of the goal for me to go through documentation and creating these quick starts is for me to go through all of these steps and run into those issues so that I can identify them and create issues for them and fix them. Because there's a lot still. There's a ton of work left, but not everything is equally important. It also depends on what is more important now compared to what can wait until later. For example, there's a bunch of activities that some people use, others may not use any of those activities. So obviously those activities don't have to be implemented just yet. So yeah, trying to find the right priority. All right, so that's the new documentation for V2.
Speaking of the docs, one last thing. We must have caught it last week right when you initially pushed the V3 docs, because I had got a message from a coworker. Elsa 3's released. And he's like, I just found it on Google. And when we got to the site, it was getting started installation, but then the rest was all lorem ipsum. I'm like,
yeah, so
reworking on the new doc site.
Yeah,
had me excited.
Yeah, that's good, but probably we should add some banner that this is work in progress, and it's not actually to be released. I pushed it just to try out the CI/CD, to try it Versal, etc. But yeah, we should make clear that this is absolutely not the release, and it's all very early and pre-alpha even. Let me make a note of that. Pre-alpha, like this. Yeah, I didn't expect that to be for people to just find it. Of course, I do realize I posted it on Discord somewhere, but more intended to be.
I think it was just a like Elsa workflows search on Google,
Oh.
and it showed up like elsaworkflows.versal.com or whatever it was.
That must be
it was
Versal.
the very,
that just
it was the like initial, I'm assuming, deployment of the template, because it was still all placeholder text throughout.
Yeah, exactly. And it still is. It still is just placeholder text, except for the homepage. It's a little tryout, but it's already out of date because you don't have to manually protect your endpoints anymore. Out of the box, the endpoints will be protected. So, and I'm not even sure I'm gonna go with OpenEdict out of the box or OpenIDDict. I don't know how to pronounce this. OpenIDDict or OpenEdict.
I think it's edict, but
yeah, I think so too. And then I had a meeting with somebody, and he pronounced it as OpenIDDict, and it would make sense. It's OpenID and then dict, but to normal humans, I would imagine you read it as OpenEdict. In any case, so everything else still is template text. So please don't read all of this.
Good news is that the URL, essentially, once you deployed the V2 docs, I went to it a few days later, and it refreshed. Once the cache refreshed, it went to the V2 docs. So that other version wasn't up for that long.
Oh yeah, that's good indeed. Yeah. Okay. One thing I still haven't figured out, I guess, is the how to deal with different versions. So, for example, version Elsa 2, it gained a lot of features if you compare version 2.0 with 2.9. And I'm wondering how to best structure this in the documentation. So with the current version of the documentation for version 2, it works like this. Docusaurus has versioning built in. So you can go to the 1.0 documentation, or to 2.1, as you can see here, or 2.2, which is the current stable version, according to the documentation. Of course, this is not the case. We are at version 2.9, and then there's pre-release versions, which is supposed to be the next version. So this is a nice system of Docusaurus. We don't get that with the syntax template. But one idea I have is that maybe there should be maybe a little drop down here that allows us to select between Elsa versions, for example, 3.0, 3.1, etc. And for version 2 would be, well, I would start with version 2.9 and then 2.9.1, 2, etc. 2.10 even. But the disadvantage with Versal, at least the way it's set up right now, is you have to use subdomains, and you cannot. At least I couldn't find it quickly, a way to do it like this, as relative paths, which might be nicer because this requires a separate deployment on Versal or a separate project on Versal. And ideally, I can get by with just one project, but using relative paths. In any case, that's something I'm.
This is why I created that option to have different menus on the left, and basically in the pages of the syntax, you could just copy it to a specific version and change the menu. And in the menu, either on the left, like you mentioned, or in the menu itself, you can switch them to different versions, and it basically goes to the old site by just copying it to a subfolder.
You see, so you're the man I was looking for.
Yeah, I told you that I wanted to be involved in the documentation, so.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, that's another idea. That's good, and it sounds like you figured that piece out. So then that would solve this issue of maintaining different versions of documentation for different versions of the product.
Yeah.
Nice. So there's another action here.
Oh.
Thanks, Frans.
I just love it how you appoint actions. But yeah, okay, cool.
As somebody told me once, delegation is key.
Yeah, now you master it.
All right, well, let's stay here. So we talked about documentation. 2.9.2 release candidate is out. It's there on NuGet. You need to make sure to, if you're using Visual Studio, to check for pre-releases. And then I didn't get any feedback on this release, so I don't know if people actually updated to it or not. But if I propose, if we don't hear anything the next week, then we should just release it, and then hopefully it won't have any serious issues like we had with 2.9.0, I believe. It contains some serious database issues for some people. But let's see, but then we can release it because it has important fixes for folks. Yeah, 2.9.1 is released, so we want to release 2.9.2. Yeah, okay. And then the next version would be 2.9.3. It has a few changes that are small, but I think it makes sense for those to be part of 2.9.x and not 2.10 yet. And I'm using those changes for a customer that ran into some issues.
Okay. Yeah, Hugo was asking if, because he's working on some interesting projects I told you about, that he was seeing how you can migrate old or existing running workflow instances into the new version of it. Mm-hmm. And that's he's writing a paper on that one. And he ran into that problem that the instances that were idle weren't starting.
Oh yeah, I remember that. I think he created an issue for it. Let's see.
Yeah, I think so too. He said he did.
Yeah, here it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then when I read this, I was like, yeah, well, that makes sense, and it should be an easy fix because it would just be looking for the idle state in addition to the running state when the workflow engine starts up. But when I looked into the code, that was already the case. So I couldn't reproduce idle workflows not being picked up. So
okay.
So I need a bit of help to repro.
Okay, I will notify him tomorrow that he can react to this one and get some better description on how to reproduce it.
Okay.
Cool.
Very cool. All right. So then let's move on to the question you had: metadata versus workflow variables.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through this? I don't know if it would help if you share your screen or not.
Yeah, probably. Let's. Okay. Share this screen. Okay, so yeah, you know, I've been working on that UI-driven thing, or Elsa driving the UI, and from that part, I noticed that there could be an issue when you have, for instance, a list of items to do, And basically what I do is I query the workflow instances, or the bookmarks actually, to see which workflow instances are waiting for a user task. And basically that will yield the to-do list.
Mm-hmm.
And that was working fine, and I did some tests. But when you mix UI with background workers, it could be that for a certain amount of time, the workflow is just progressing through the backend stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not at that point waiting for a user task.
Oh, and then it's well, it's not waiting for you. So do you mean the bookmarks will be removed at that point?
Yeah, exactly, because there is no suspended activity at that point. So when I query the bookmarks, it's not there. And
yeah, because the bookmark was resumed, right?
Yeah.
So the user performed their action, which resumes the bookmark, and the bookmark being resumed, it's basically being consumed, which means
Yeah.
it's being deleted, and therefore there will not be any tasks in to be displayed to the user. And if there's some background worker processing the workflow, which could take a while, then for a certain amount of time there's no actions for the user to be taken.
Yeah, exactly. And in that demo that I created, it was also that it went to that detail page where with signal R, it was basically going through each of the steps and get updated from the backend stating what the action at that time was. But I only get a signal back stating, yeah, I'm busy, I'm doing this, but not the context of the case that was handled in that workflow instance. And the user reported back and they say, yeah, it's fine, it's fun to see, but I don't see for which specific ID or a case file number this is, and I want to have some context knowing which one is running. And then I thought, yeah, I set it up like the user task would provide the UI hint and the UI data to indicate what to show on the screen. But since it's running at that point not a user task, I don't have access to that. So the one thing that I could come up with was, okay, I see when I get the workflow instance details, I also get the metadata back. It's a dictionary of key value. And I can project some major things into that metadata, indicating it's this case number, it's this status that it has, and this is the log, for instance. So the UI could still show some details about the workflow and the state of it, while not being actively running on a user task. But now I was a bit doubting, like, okay, is that a best practice? And it was kind of funny because they implemented it and they moved now everything into the metadata. All variables are gone and everything is in the metadata. Thought, well, it's an option. I have to say that, but if it's a good option, I don't know. And I wanted to hear about the perspective of it and maybe the things that you encountered already by using metadata.
Yeah, so let me see. I don't recall using metadata myself, but it is there to store, to give activities an option to store some data, or maybe some application. I don't recall, but let me take a look at some of the usings, if there are any. And looks like in the Elsa solution itself, nobody's really using it. I mean, it's persisted and it's being loaded. That's basically it. But from a data structure point of view, I think it's perfectly fine. The variables are there, just as a more explicit structure or construct for workflow implementers or process designers to use to set variables and get variables. But I don't see any issue if your application is using metadata directly, because at the end of the day, both kinds of stores get persisted as part of the workflow instance. And this is just a dictionary, but variables, are like this object here is also
sorry, I stopped sharing, so maybe you're not
Oh,
sharing.
Yeah, I'm not sharing. Thank you. Let me fix that. But I was probably describing it so well that you could picture it, right?
Yeah. I already documented it as well.
Nice. Let's see. Yeah, so I was pointing at this workflow instance model, which stores everything. So we have variables here, we have metadata here, but structurally it's the same.
And is it also possible
variables,
that
it uses a dictionary under the cover. So from that point of view, it's fine. It's more semantically, it's different. And I would say variables are intended to be used by process designers, and metadata is would be more intended to be used by activities or application code, just to store whatever you want to associate application-specific information with a workflow instance.
And is it also possible to retrieve it from the metadata using Liquid or JavaScript?
It's possible, but I don't know if there are any expressions for that available today. But it would be easy to implement either from your application itself or by adding it to one of the just the core library itself. So, for example, go to scripting and let's say JavaScript. It would be good to add it to, let's see, handlers, configure JavaScript engine, to add a function somewhere here to get metadata. It would make sense. Yeah, and I just also found that actually there is code using set metadata and get metadata. For example, the compensation service that was added relatively recently. And it's, as you can see, it's storing some internal state that's used by the compensation service. It sets some metadata called compensated to true. And then that's used someplace else. So yeah.
Okay. Well, then we have to think about, because I see now it's just hard coded in the code and not somewhere that we can reference it to. It will become a bit more complicated to document, for instance, which are the reserved words that you can't use for your own variables in the metadata.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, probably we should introduce some sort of namespacing, or you should do it. Maybe use my app : and then whatever to ensure there's no no collisions.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, and I will go by this because I like the way that just the way to get the workflow instances just yielded the metadata automatically as well. So I could leverage quite easy on that to extend the UI and show some more details about the workflow instance while not running a user task. So yeah, great feature though.
Yeah, makes sense. One thing that it doesn't provide you with is the ability to search on any of those custom fields. And for that reason, we need to implement, at least I think what we should do is implement some search indexer like Lucene or Elasticsearch, so that potentially, whatever your application associates with your workflow instance, you should be able to search on any of those fields. Let's say you have workflows dealing with customers or orders. Maybe you want to, search by some attribute belonging to some customer. And it would be good to, as workflow instances progress, to have different kinds of, not sinks, I guess, but some destinations that allows your application to, for example, maintain an index of the ongoing process instances, so that you can search on them for dashboarding purposes and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah. That would be nice, but for now I can manage with the functionality that's already there. So
cool. That's
cool.
Great.
Thanks.
No worries. Oh yeah, this is what I was looking for: indexing, Elasticsearch. So there's some start has been made here, I think. But to be honest, I've never used it, so I don't know what it would do today. All right, so that's done and dusted. Actions are going to be taken. Links. Yeah, this is all I have. Well, one final thing, I guess, would be Elsa 3 status. So what's left? What is a potential ETA for a release candidate? We are looking at the Elsa 3 project board here, and this is an attempt to visualize everything that is still going on. It doesn't communicate what we need to do for the release candidate. For that, I actually should set up a milestone. But at least this is some known work that that's going on, and that probably most of these will have to be done before the release candidate, especially the little bugs. Proto actor activities, absolutely not a must-have. This is a nice-to-have. But there's little things like automatic layout. That's very important. It's not a complicated feature, but important because it allows the designer to display workflows that are created from code. And as you may know, the Elsa 3 designer uses positional information like X and Y coordinates because it supports drag and drop. But for coded workflows, there is no such information available. So we need some automatic layout feature to lay out the workflow. So this is important for the release candidate. Other than that, I think it's mostly things like the ability to add a workflow variable. There's no button to add it, so it's a little broken feature. It's easy to fix. There will be some categories of activities that are lacking at the moment, and some of these activities are there, but they lack certain features. So stuff like that. And as I mentioned, while I go through documentation and imagine using Elsa 3 from the perspective of a new user that's just starting out, going through a journey, I will identify the most important issues. So it's probably gonna take a few weeks, I would imagine. And then there's cool new features. So Elsa 3 already has many new cool features like asynchronous activity execution, to name one thing. Another thing is, of course, composite activities, which is not the same as Elsa 2's concept of composition. It's different. It's more similar to Windows Workflow Foundation, as we've covered in past meetings, but also things like generator activities, which it's experimental, but it would allow you to put an activity on a workflow somewhere in the middle. It doesn't have to be a starting activity, doesn't have to be an ending activity, it can be just somewhere. And it would basically generate events, whatever those events may be. It could be a timer. So regardless of where the workflow execution is, once a generator activity is active or hot, it will continuously fire those events. Some scenarios will be enabled by that. But I have yet to receive some feedback on this idea, because I can also imagine that some people will find it confusing, because the workflow typically goes through a journey, and you should be able to tell where the state of the workflow is at a certain point. And if you have a generator activity, it can just keep driving the workflow from the point of that activity. But I think it's an interesting experiment nonetheless. So yeah, timeline-wise, still looking at Q1 of the next year. So hopefully January there will be at least some packages to try it out. I'm not so convinced it will be release candidate quality, but it's also not impossible. So I'm not gonna say it's not gonna happen. I also can't say it will happen. We will see. It's getting closer, that's for sure. All right, that's all I have. Does anyone have any questions or other topics they would like to discuss before we close off?
No, not for me.
All right, Michael, Christina, you guys are good. Christina is good.
No additional questions on my side. Thank you.
All right. Then thank you for attending, and we'll catch you later.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.